This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. This chapter is called The Night Was Hell. Let's begin. Up until that point, everything had gone reasonably well. We would have been happy, however, if we would have already made it through the night. It was clear to everyone that the Russians would try to counterattack us. At the onset of darkness, 2 of our patrols left to establish contact to the east and west. The night from April 6 to 7, 1944, was probably one of the worst ones of the entire war for all of us. We were right in the middle of the Russians and didn't know whether they would cut off our way back. Our APCs had driven back during the day to fetch the winter clothing. During the night, they had to bring ammunition and rations up front. That was a more than difficult mission, which demanded courage, stamina, and an extraordinary sense of duty. The men had to box their way through again and again, first to the north and then to the south. The Russians did everything to block their path. Many APCs fell victim to the exposed mines. The route could only be kept open thanks to the courage of Graf Strachwitz's aide, Lieutenant Günther Famula, who had been assigned this difficult mission. On April 22nd, Famula was killed by a bomb dropped from a Russian airplane during our next operation at Krywasu. He was never able to wear the Knight's Cross, which was awarded to him on May 15th. The Russians attacked our defensive perimeter with strong forces from all sides. The forces cut off by us in the north attempted to break out to the south. From the south, Ivan conducted vigorous relief attacks to destroy us and maintain his forward positions. It was a bitter night for the battalion. It was under heavy fire from the enemy the entire night and suffered heavy losses. The seriously wounded were transported to the rear in APCs. The slightly wounded preferred to stay with us. Our Stuka squadrons brought us hardly any relief because they couldn't drop their bombs right next to us. Besides, the heavy things would sink so far into the marshy ground that they made large craters but caused little damage. The Russians had also concentrated so many anti-aircraft guns, primarily rapid-fire weapons, that it was impossible for our Stukas to dive low enough. The times when our Stukas were able to demoralize the enemy were long gone. The forward observers of the artillery units helped us the most. They were able to give us some breathing space occasionally due to their superbly directed fire. We hardly believed it when morning finally came and we were still alive. Ivan still hadn't given up his efforts to dislodge us, but everything looked different with the onset of daylight. The oppressive darkness in which you could identify neither friend nor foe was gone. We could see who was in front of us again. During the morning, the ground began to soften up under the influence of the April sun. Soon our tanks had sunk so deeply into the marshy ground that they were practically sitting on their hulls. We just managed to get to the trail and set up security there. The first elements of the infantry regiment then came forward and occupied the new front lines. The rest combed the pocket from north to south. One of our tanks, Wesley's, had been hit the previous evening right at the fork in the road. A heavy artillery round had crippled him, and he sat helpless in the open, exposed to possible attacks by Russian patrols. Our commander had driven back to the Kinderheim during the evening. I called Shatrov several times and told him that he needed to tow Wesley. Von Schiller was once again not in his tank, and also didn't return after some time. I finally went myself and freed Wesley from his miserable situation. We could scarcely recognize the commander and the men of the Fusilier battalion who had survived the hell of the past few days. They appeared to have been aged by years. We were withdrawn at the conclusion of the operation. We then drove back along the Rollbahn toward Silima. Well beyond the front, a Russian observation balloon observed the ridgeline that the road crossed. It was well known that the Russians immediately opened fire at any movement along the roads. I gave the express order that hatches were to be closed in this sector, or at the very least that heads had to be kept in the tank. Feldwebel Link didn't bother with that and was exposed down to the belt buckle in his cupola. 3 tanks had already gone by the high ground when the first salvo landed to the right and left of the Rollbahn. At the same moment, I saw Link collapse into the turret looking like he had been struck by lightning. Because the tank didn't stop, I brought it to a halt by radio. The crew hadn't noticed that its commander had been seriously wounded. He hadn't made a sound. We attempted to pull him out of the turret, but he cried out in pain as if we wanted to tear him in pieces. A large piece of shrapnel had penetrated through the hip and ripped open all of one side. He looked terrible, and we were afraid that we would not be able to bring him to the field hospital alive. To our relief, the doctor determined that no vital organs had been hit. After a few weeks, we received the news that Link had gone on convalescent leave. Once again, we had got off easy, but these unnecessary casualties always upset me more than any heavy combat. We finally had a few days of rest and were able to get our damaged vehicles back in shape. One morning, we received a surprise visit from a vehicle from the public radio section of a propaganda company. These folks had the mission of recording our defensive fighting of March 17th. This was to occur in an authentic manner on wax records. At first, all sorts of stories were told, until the electrician had laid a wire from the commander's tank into our room. It connected the radio in the tank with the recording device next to us. When everything finally worked, I had to get into the tank, while the propaganda man took the place of the radio operator. The drama was ready to begin. I had to give a semblance of the radio traffic and orders that I had given out on the day of the battle. Of course, fire commands and similar things were also given. Von Schiller sat in the room and played my partner as the company commander. After all, he had been named in the Wehrmacht Daily Report. The frontline report needed to refer to that. When I had enough of this gruesome game, we called it quits. The record was played back right away, but it did not find approval under the demanding eyes of the experts. We had to repeat everything once again. At certain intervals, the propaganda man gave his fantasy-filled description of the events. In a realistic fashion, he portrayed how the tanks were burning, how they fired, how they were hit, and how all hell was breaking loose everywhere. The second recording finally met with approval. Then a few comrades who had record players at home were allowed to make a recording as a sort of letter. It was sent to the folks back home. No one recognized his own voice anymore when the record was played back. Only the text revealed who had actually spoken. In general, these propaganda guys weren't to our liking. By that, it shouldn't be inferred there weren't terrific guys among them who took their job seriously and were also good soldiers to boot. But exceptions prove the rule. Usually they were strange types who showed up dressed as soldiers in their pseudo-officer uniforms. This hybrid between not quite soldier and not quite civilian was very unfortunate. Besides, we saw most of the propaganda men as the darlings of the propaganda ministry. They only viewed the war as a pleasant change of pace. They were also allowed all sorts of preferential treatment compared to the foot soldier at the front. That was why we enjoyed the exceptions, as I already noted, even more so. Unfortunately, there were some among them who gave their lives for their country. We heard our propaganda report a few days later during the normal radio program. We were amazed at how well the sounds of battle had been added in Berlin. We could barely understand our own voices for all the shooting going on. For that reason, the report unleashed all sorts of laughter among us. After that experience, we never again took a report from the front seriously. When our guests departed, I was supposed to sign a paper certifying that the propaganda man who filed the report had sat in my tank. I left this to the company commander, who could do that with a clear conscience. It was, after all, his tank in which the story had taken place. It didn't become clear to us what great good fortune we had that the operation was a success until the prisoners had been interrogated. Among other officers, our advance guard had taken prisoner the operations officer of the division in the East Sack. The rapidly advancing tanks of the Grossdeutschland division had reached the division command post, located at the base of the pocket so quickly that the Russian divisional commander still hadn't received any word of our breakthrough. All the lines had been broken during the preparatory fire. The surprised operations officer was still only in his shirt upon our arrival, and had to dress quickly in order to be taken captive. The Russian general, it should be noted, had already taken off for the south. We discovered through our prisoners that an entire Russian division had been assembled in the pocket. It had been equipped with a lot of heavy weapons. The Russian hadn't considered such a catastrophe possible. The remainder of their tank brigade, which had already suffered considerably in the previous defensive fighting, was likewise still in the marshy woods where it had no maneuver room at all. It fell into our hands without a scratch. The interrogation of the Russian captain was very informative. It should be noted that he made a superior impression. even in his clothing. I saw that the Russians had returned to the wide shoulder boards that had been forbidden for a while. Medals were also awarded and worn again. The other side had also come to the conclusion that soldiers place value on being able to show their combat skills to the outside world by the wearing of awards. Based on the statements of the Russian captain, our attack had come as a complete surprise to them. They had never expected a frontal assault from the north. They thought that the northern front at Lembitu had been fortified so well that nothing could happen to it by any stretch of the imagination. I also wouldn't have wanted to experience what would have happened had we got stuck at the railway embankment and the 10 Russian anti-tank positions had been occupied. The Russians had expected our attack along the bottom of the sack from the east and west. That was the shortest route, and the west sack had also been liquidated in this fashion. To avoid the repetition of just such a disaster, the Russian lines on both sides of the bottom of the sack had been mined in all sorts of tricky ways. Even the trees had been connected with tripwires. No infantryman would have been able to get through there in one piece, regardless of whether he walked, stooped, or crawled on the ground, but this mining proved fateful to the Russians themselves. After our breakthrough, they were no longer able to break out to the side and withdraw. The Russians cursed their commissars as much as we did our own Nazi political officers. They were also becoming an increasing nuisance to us at the front. They usually hung around division headquarters, however. We only noticed their presence through the circulars that were occasionally sent to the frontline units. Politics didn't play any role at all for those of us at the front. It would have appeared idiotic to me if I had said Heil Hitler to my men during morning formation. After all, the most varied types of people were thrown together in the same struggle and subject to the same harsh laws. There were Nazis and opponents of the regime, as well as completely disinterested parties. They were united in comradeship. It was completely unimportant whether one did his job for the Führer or for his country or out of a sense of duty. The political or non-political opinions of the others didn't interest anyone. The main thing was that he was a good comrade and a halfway decent soldier. If that was true, then everything worked out. After all the difficulties that lay behind us, we enjoyed our breather in Silami to its fullest. But something pulled me back to the site of the carnage. I wanted to see it one more time in a more peaceful atmosphere, so I left on the spur of the moment in my kubel and paid a visit to the former East Sack. Since I didn't have to concentrate on the enemy anymore, I realized how ghastly the terrain appeared that had been so bitterly and continuously contested for the previous few weeks. As I drove back in the darkness, my flesh crawled. The air was still full of the stink that burned-out tanks always left behind. The materiel of the Russians lay scattered all over the place. On the plain, I found a Russian tank turret all by itself. It had survived all the artillery fire. At the beginning of the fighting, we had knocked out this Russian tank. The turret had been ripped off the hull by the explosion and flew through the air. We ducked our heads, and in fact, the turret didn't land too far from us. The cannon bored into the marshy ground almost up to the gun mantlet, while the turret jutted upright as if on a stick. Almost all the trees in the woods south of the railway embankment were charred black and shot to pieces. It created a ghostly impression, as if all life had completely died out. Not a single living creature was to be seen in these dead woods. The birds had withdrawn after all of nature had been trampled on by the humans. It was always interesting for us to see how well the Russians were capable of constructing positions, even under the most difficult circumstances. The artillery pieces and the mortars had been built up on corduroy stands and completely protected by beams against shrapnel. No human could dig in deeply in that marshy terrain. The shallow Russian bunkers, if that's what one wants to call their dugouts, actually protected against the fire of heavy weapons unless they received a direct hit. We were able to determine that all the Russians who had been in their provisional bunkers had gotten off with a good scare. Even the connecting trenches between the rail crossing and our former eastward strongpoint had been constructed in an exemplary fashion. This showed me that it was possible to dig in quickly despite frost and marshy terrain. Our regimental commander had considered this impossible, Strong points, without heavy weapons and without contact with one another, will always be lost whenever a massed attack starts. The man dug into the ground has already been psychologically prevented from giving his best. He finds himself in constant fear that he may not be able to get out of his foxhole during an enemy breakthrough because he is a goner in the open. Therefore, he will logically do that which our guys did when the Russians penetrated. That is to say, he will attempt to get to safety during the artillery barrage. This concludes the 13th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.